The night glittered with promise, but beneath the polished glass towers of Victoria Island, danger stirred unseen. From the rooftop of Lagos's most opulent hotel, where the skyline shimmered like 1,000 diamonds, Adekunle Oladimeji raised a glass of champagne to celebrate his empire. The crowd cheered, but among them, a single pair of eyes held more poison than admiration. The rooftop gala was a portrait of excess. Crystal chandeliers dangled under a sky so clear it looked painted, while an orchestra bathed the air in smooth jazz. Waiters glided like shadows, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres carved into delicate works of art. Gold champagne bottles popped one after another, each cork bursting like a small announcement that Adekunle's reign as Nigeria's youngest billionaire was untouchable. At the center of it all stood Adekunle Oladimeji, a man whose presence silenced entire rooms without command. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, the lapels glistening under the soft glow of rooftop lights. At just 36, his empire stretched across continents, technology, luxury real estate, high fashion, and a growing AI tech firm that promised to put Africa at the front of global innovation. His smile was magnetic, his handshake firm, his words soaked in quiet authority. Tonight, he wasn't just celebrating another business venture. He was unveiling a groundbreaking partnership with European and Asian investors, an AI-driven platform designed to revolutionize African markets. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and every guest knew they were standing in the presence of history. Yet, as applause echoed across the rooftop, Adekunle's younger brother, Folarin, stood a step behind him, his smile as polished as the marble floors but hollow. The resemblance between them was striking, tall, handsome, sharp-featured. But while Adekunle radiated confidence, Folarin exuded an unease he concealed behind laughter and charm. His tailored, white tuxedo gleamed. Yet beneath the perfection of his appearance lingered something darker, an envy sharpened over years of living in his brother's shadow. Adekunle raised his glass higher, to family, to loyalty, and to a future where Africa leads the world in innovation. His voice carried across the rooftop, deep and commanding, resonating with pride. The crowd erupted into cheers. Glasses clinked, investors nodded approvingly. But when Folarin stepped forward to respond with a toast of his own, Amara, the quiet maid serving champagne near the back, noticed what no one else did. The hesitation in his eyes, the forced twitch of his lips as he lifted his glass. "To my brother, Adekunle," Folarin began, his voice smooth but tight. "May your empire never fall, and may you always find strength in the family that stands by you." The crowd roared in appreciation, oblivious. But Amara saw it, the faint shadow in his gaze, a chill that sliced through the warmth of his words. She had served in this household long enough to recognize masks, and Folarin's smile tonight was the heaviest mask of all. Amara herself was nearly invisible in the world of luxury she served. Clad in her crisp maid's uniform, she floated through the gala like a ghost, her eyes sharper than anyone realized. Her life was one of quiet sacrifice, wages sent to a small village to care for her ailing father and younger siblings. She never belonged in such glittering rooms, yet fate had placed her here, within arm's reach of the most powerful men in Lagos. Her gaze lingered on Adekunle, who was now laughing easily with European investors. To the world he was a titan. To her he was more complicated. A man who once paused to ask about her sick father, who ensured her younger brother's school fees were paid when she didn't dare ask. His kindness had carved a permanent place in her loyalty, which was why tonight, as she watched Folarin's thin smile, unease tightened in her chest. The gala stretched on. Music swelled. Guests drifted between conversations about politics, luxury yachts, and the stock market. Adekunle moved gracefully, effortlessly balancing charm with intellect. He was a man who seemed born for the spotlight. But Folarin's gaze never left him. Behind every polite laugh, behind every clink of his glass, his envy smoldered like a fire contained in crystal. When Adekunle, full of warmth, clasped his brother's shoulder and declared, "None of this would be possible without Folarin's loyalty," the audience applauded thunderously. Cameras flashed. Investors smiled approvingly at the image of family unity. But Amara saw it, saw the slight flicker in Folarin's expression, the quick tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes clouded for just a second before he bowed his head. The applause faded into murmurs. The orchestra swayed into another soft tune, and amid the noise, as glasses rose once again in Adekunle's honor, Folarin leaned into his glass, his lips barely moving, his voice lost in the clamor. Tonight, he whispered. Venom hidden behind charm marks the beginning of his end. The words slipped into the night air like smoke unheard by all but one. Amara froze, the tray trembling in her hands. The city glittered, the champagne sparkled, the music soared, but in that single whispered moment, the empire of Adekunle Oladimeji had already begun to tremble. In the hush of night, long after the rooftop gala had ended, Folarin sat alone in his luxury apartment, staring at his reflection in the glass wall. Lagos glittered below like a kingdom he could never touch. To the world, he was the billionaire's brother. To himself, he was nothing but a shadow. And shadows, he decided, were meant to consume the light. Folarin Oladimeji had grown up in wealth, yet never in power. Their father's mansion in Ikoyi was a palace of marble staircases, chandeliers from Italy, and imported Persian rugs that swallowed his small feet as a boy. But even within such splendor, there had always been an invisible wall, one built not of brick or stone, but of preference. He remembered dinners at the long mahogany table where their father asked Adekunle about his grades, his ambitions, his dreams. The same father who beamed with pride when Adekunle designed his first software program at 15, a program that caught the attention of teachers and investors alike. But when Folarin spoke of wanting to model clothes or start a boutique, his father's eyes dimmed with disappointment. "Follow your brother's example," he would say, a phrase that echoed in Folarin's skull like a curse. That echo never left. As years passed, Adekunle soared. Universities courted him, business leaders admired him, and their father's pride grew larger than the mansion walls. Meanwhile, Folarin stumbled through ventures in fashion, hospitality, even real estate. One after another, they crumbled not always from lack of effort, but from poor timing, weak decisions, and an absence of the sharp instinct that defined Adekunle. Investors whispered. Friends laughed behind closed doors. His wealth came not from his own sweat, but from his brother's endless handouts. And that humiliation was sharper than hunger. By 32, Folarin had more cars than he could drive, more clothes than he could wear, and yet when he entered any room alongside Adekunle, the spotlight tilted away from him. He could see it in women's eyes the way they leaned closer to Adekunle, their laughter brighter, their admiration deeper. He could hear it in the media's endless stories. Adekunle the prodigy, Adekunle the empire builder, Adekunle the future of Africa. But what of Folarin? A footnote, a name only remembered because it followed his brothers. The bitterness festered. At luxury lounges in Victoria Island, where champagne flowed and deals were whispered over Cuban cigars, Folarin's so-called friends reminded him of his place. "If not for Adekunle, would you even be sitting here?" one joked with a smirk. The laughter that followed seared his pride. He smiled outwardly, but inside he was drowning. Luxury without respect was a prison with golden bars. And slowly, envy became more than an emotion, it became a fire. He told himself Adekunle didn't deserve it all, not the empire, not the respect, not the women, not the adoration of nations. Why should one man hold everything while another suffocated in silence? He was the second son. Yes, but second sons could rise. Second sons could take. The first seeds of betrayal took root one rain-drenched evening when he found himself in a dimly lit lounge in Lekki, surrounded by men whose suits cost fortunes but whose eyes gleamed with hunger. They were rival businessmen, some former allies of Adekunle, others who had lost deals to him. They too carried grudges. The conversation began with idle talk of stock markets and oil prices, but soon it shifted. "Your brother builds too fast," one man murmured, swirling whiskey in his glass. "Empires that rise that quickly, they can be made to fall just as fast." Another leaned forward, his voice low. "Every king has an Achilles heel, even Adekunle." The words struck deep. Folarin didn't respond immediately, but something inside him stirred a dangerous curiosity. Night after night, he returned. And night after night, their whispers sharpened into plans. They painted visions of what life could be if Adekunle were weakened, of how Folarin could step into the space his brother left behind, of how he could finally wear the crown instead of standing in its shadow. It wasn't just temptation, it was validation. The more they spoke, the more intoxicating it became. They promised to guide him, to give him tools, to set traps his brother would never see coming. All they needed was his willingness, his signature, his silence, his betrayal. At first, he hesitated. The thought of betraying his own blood tugged at him. Memories of shared laughter, of childhood games, of Adekunle shielding him from bullies at school, these moments flickered like dying candles. But greed blew them out one by one. By the time the final meeting came, he no longer trembled. In a penthouse overlooking the Atlantic, the rivals presented him with documents, contracts crafted with precision, deals that would redirect the flow of wealth and power. All it needed was his agreement. Folarin looked out at the city that adored his brother and ignored him. He thought of every whisper, every smirk, every woman who turned away, every time his father's voice had chosen Adekunle's name over his. His hand didn't shake as he picked up the pen. He signed. And with that signature, the seeds of betrayal rooted themselves fully. As the men around him clinked glasses in triumph, Folarin leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "This," he said quietly, almost to himself, "is where his empire begins to fall." The night outside was still. But within, the ground beneath Adekunle's empire had already shifted. The mansion slept under the quiet hum of Lagos night, but Amara was still awake, moving silently through its golden halls. To others, she was invisible, a maid with lowered eyes and careful steps, but invisibility had its gift. It allowed her to see what no one else dared notice, and what she saw in Folarin's shadows chilled her to the bone. Amara's life was never meant to intersect with the glimmering towers of wealth. She had been born in a small village where the stars seemed closer than the nearest hospital. Her father's illness had struck like sudden harmattan wind, dry, merciless, and consuming. When he could no longer farm, the burden fell on Amara, the eldest. Lagos had been the answer, though it felt like exile. She arrived barefoot in spirit, her dreams left behind with the red earth of her village. By the time she was taken in as a maid at Adekunle Oladimeji's Banana Island mansion, her life had become a rhythm of cleaning glass floors that mirrored her face, ironing suits worth more than her father's farmland, and preparing tables she would never eat from. But Adekunle was not like the other rich men she had imagined. Where others dismissed servants with cold nods, he asked after her family. Where most billionaires walked through life armored by pride, he wore his power lightly. Once, when her father's hospital bills grew too steep, she gathered courage to speak, and before she finished, Adekunle had settled the debt without fanfare. Another time, he noticed the holes in her shoes and arranged for replacements, delivered quietly so she wouldn't be embarrassed. To Amara, Adekunle was not merely an employer. He was a man whose kindness cut through her hardships like morning sun through fog. It was this quiet admiration that made her watchful. Unlike the other staff who hurried through their duties, eager only for wages, Amara observed. She studied. The family's dynamics unfolded before her like an unscripted play. Adekunle's warmth was genuine, but Folarin's presence always seemed touched by something darker. She saw it in small things, the way his smile stiffened when Adekunle entered a room, the quick roll of his eyes when his brother's name was praised. She told herself she was imagining things, but the mansion had a way of whispering truths. Late at night, while dusting the long glass corridor, she noticed Folarin slipping into corners, speaking in hushed tones to men she didn't recognize. Sometimes he disappeared into the study with papers clutched tightly to his chest, emerging with the air of someone who carried secrets too heavy to share. Her intuition sharpened like a blade. Something was wrong. Something dangerous. One evening, as she carried linens past the garden, she caught the faint sound of voices. Curious, she slowed her steps, pausing by the French doors. He said, "Joys." Folarin stood there, his face half hidden by shadows, speaking to a man with a scar across his cheek. Their words were low, hurried, but their tone carried the urgency of plotting. She couldn't catch every phrase, but fragments reached her. Shares. Transfer. He won't see it coming. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Though she was just a maid, though her world was supposed to remain small, a sense of duty anchored itself in her chest. Adekunle had done more for her family than she could ever repay. If danger threatened him, if betrayal crept within his walls, wasn't it her place to guard him even silently? Yet fear chained her tongue. What if she was wrong? What if she accused Folarin unfairly? Worse still, what if she spoke and lost her job? Her family's survival depended on her wages. So Amara swallowed the knowledge, hiding it behind lowered eyes and quiet steps. But her admiration for Adekunle deepened. The more she saw of his humility, the way he greeted staff by name, the way he knelt beside his mother's grave on anniversaries, the way he shared meals with old friends who had nothing, the more her heart shifted. She had entered the mansion as a servant, but she remained because loyalty bound her tighter than wages ever could. In time, she became more than a maid. She was the invisible guardian, the eyes and ears that no one noticed. She listened when others ignored. She remembered when others forgot. She pieced together whispers, gestures, and silences until the truth painted itself clear. Folarin was plotting something vast, something that could shake the empire built on Adekunle's brilliance. And then it happened. One humid evening, as rain threatened the horizon, Amara moved quietly past the study. The door was ajar, light spilling across the polished floor. Folarin's voice carried out, sharper than usual, brimming with suppressed rage. By the time he realizes, he told the man opposite him, everything will already belong to me. The words froze Amara in place. Her knees weakened, her tray nearly slipped from her hands. The storm outside had not yet broken, but inside, the thunder had already struck. In that instant, she knew the empire she served was in grave danger, and she alone carried the burden of knowing. The boardroom smelled of power and polished mahogany, but beneath the gleam of crystal water pitchers and designer suits, knives were being sharpened, silent, invisible, and aimed straight at Adekunle Oladimeji's back. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Oladimeji Global Holdings, casting golden light across the sleek conference table where Adekunle's most trusted board members gathered. On the surface, it was a meeting of strategy expansion into Europe, new AI patents, and a partnership with a Silicon Valley firm. But beneath the smiles and nods, suspicion was quietly being sown. At the center of it was Folarin. Once merely the younger brother with no significant stake, he now sat confidently in a tailored charcoal suit, leaning forward as though the future of the company rested in his hands. His voice carried warmth, his laughter was easy, but his words dripped poison. "Gentlemen," Folarin said smoothly, "we all admire my brother's vision. But don't you think, perhaps, he's moving too quickly?" A ripple of unease moved through the room. He let the silence stretch, then continued. "Expansion is exciting, yes. But reckless growth? That can be dangerous. I worry about his stress. He hardly sleeps, barely eats. Sometimes, I fear he isn't as stable as he once was." It was a masterstroke. He never outright accused Adekunle of weakness. Instead, he wrapped the doubt in silk, presenting himself as the concerned brother. The board shifted uncomfortably. They remembered Adekunle's long nights, his relentless drive, his perfectionism. Folarin's words found purchase. What they didn't know was that he had already begun, leaking sensitive information to rival businessmen, the same men he met in smoky penthouses, their glasses of cognac clinking over whispered strategies, contracts, projections, trade secrets, tiny cuts that together bled Adekunle's empire from within. Folarin understood the psychology of doubt. He didn't need to destroy his brother in one strike. He needed only to weaken the foundation until the weight of the empire collapsed on its own. Meanwhile, Adekunle remained blind. In his world, family meant loyalty. Folarin's presence at his side reassured him rather than alarmed him. When whispers of betrayal reached his ears through distant contacts, he dismissed them. "Not Folarin," he said, waving it off with a smile. "My brother is my right hand." It was the very trust that made him vulnerable. As Adekunle poured his energy into preparing for the company's European debut, Folarin worked in shadows, charming investors with carefully placed doubts. Over dinner tables at Echo Hotel, he leaned close to financiers, lowering his voice like a confidant. "I admire my brother," he'd say. "But sometimes I wonder, is he pushing himself too far?" The words spread like perfume, subtle, intoxicating, lingering long after he left. Back at the mansion, Amara began noticing strange patterns. Men she didn't recognize arrived at odd hours, slipping through side entrances with briefcases and hushed conversations. She heard the low rumble of voices in rooms where meetings were never meant to happen. "Just business." One of the other staff shrugged when she asked, "Don't worry yourself, Amara." But worry was all she could do. She carried linens past doors that pulsed with secrets, her heart heavy with foreboding. She had seen the storm in Folarin's eyes at the gala, and now the thunder rolled closer each night. Adekunle, though, ignored the warning signs. He felt a faint tension among his board, a subtle coolness in some handshakes, but he brushed it aside. "They're just cautious," he told himself. "Big deals make people nervous." He didn't see how Folarin's charm was carving into the walls of his empire, and Folarin, intoxicated by his own cunning, pressed further. He orchestrated private dinners with key board members, feeding them half-truths about Adekunle's mental strain. He allowed documents to accidentally reach rival companies. Each move was invisible on its own, but together they formed a web designed to strangle Adekunle's control. Finally, the moment came. In a quiet office far from the glare of the boardroom, Folarin sat across from one of Adekunle's competitors, a sleek man in a navy suit with ambition burning in his eyes. Between them lay a legal agreement that would quietly transfer key shares and assets into the hands of those who wanted Adekunle weakened. Folarin's pen hovered above the paper. For a brief moment, he thought of his brother's smile, of the toast on the rooftop, of the years they had shared. But the image dissolved quickly, consumed by years of resentment, envy, and the intoxicating scent of power. He pressed the pen to the page. Stroke by stroke, his signature curved into place, and with that flourish, the silent dagger slid deeper, unseen, into the heart of Adekunle's empire. The office was still. The deal was done. But somewhere in the mansion, as night fell over Lagos, Amara stirred in her small quarters, unable to shake the sense that the storm she feared had just broken its first lightning bolt. The city called him a titan, a man who held Lagos in the palm of his hand. Yet, when the lights dimmed and the crowds vanished, Adekunle Oladimeji stood alone on his penthouse balcony, staring at the restless waves of the Atlantic, and wondered if all his empires had only built him a kingdom of silence. Adekunle's life glittered with achievements, but his heart carried scars unseen. For every billion-dollar deal, for every luxury car and island estate, there was a wound that wealth could never heal, the wound of love betrayed. He remembered her face as though it were carved in glass. Ifeoma, the woman he once thought he would marry. She had laughed at his jokes when he was still unknown, had whispered dreams of children and a life of partnership. But as his empire rose, so did her distance. The day she left, her words stung sharper than any rival's betrayal. "You're not the man I fell in love with. You're just a wallet with a face." That was the night Adekunle learned the cruel truth. In his world, affection was currency, and his wealth made him a target rather than a partner. Since then, he distrusted the softness of love. He built walls, elegant and impenetrable, fortified by steel and glass. He entertained women at galas, yes, models, entrepreneurs, socialites, but never let them near the fragile core of him. Behind every smile lurked suspicion. Do you see me, or do you see my bank account? Now, alone on the balcony of his Victoria Island penthouse, the ocean breeze tugged at his silk shirt. The city's neon glow stretched endlessly, but even in that brilliance, loneliness pressed against him like an unwelcome shadow. He sipped a glass of wine, his eyes reflecting the restless water below. His empire stretched farther than he had ever dreamed, yet his bed remained cold, his laughter hollow once the crowds dispersed. For a man who had everything, he carried the ache of one who had nothing. It was on one of these nights that Amara, moving quietly through the penthouse with a tray, caught a glimpse of him unguarded. She paused, hidden by the doorway, watching the man the world called invincible lean heavily on the railing as though the weight of his wealth pressed him down. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire, but as a man, a lonely man. She stepped back silently, unwilling to intrude, but the image stayed with her long after. The contrast between Adekunle the Titan and Adekunle the man pierced her. By day, he commanded boardrooms, silenced investors, and shaped the future of industries. By night, he stood alone with memories of heartbreak and the bitter taste of mistrust. Perhaps that was why he noticed small things others overlooked. A week later, as she served breakfast, he asked, "How is your father's health, Amara?" She blinked, surprised, he remembered. "Better, sir," she replied softly. "And your brother's school fees? Has he returned to classes?" Her throat tightened. She hadn't told him the fees were overdue, but he must have noticed, must have quietly ensured they were paid. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, eyes lowered to hide the emotion burning there. He nodded, as if it were a simple gesture. But to Amara, it was everything. Each act of kindness drew her closer to him, not in bold ways, but in the silent chambers of her heart. She admired him, not for his wealth, but for his humanity. Yet she buried her feelings beneath the uniform she wore, reminding herself she was only a maid, a shadow in his grand world. Still, her eyes lingered longer when he walked past. Her heart softened when he smiled, even faintly. She dreamed not in words, not in confessions, but in the quiet corners of her soul where longing could exist without consequence. Unbeknownst to Adekunle, danger already coiled around him. His empire was being hollowed from within, and the very brother he trusted most was sharpening the knife. Yet in these fragile moments of loneliness, Adekunle sought the one anchor he believed unshakable. One evening, As they stood together overlooking the city, the billionaire and his brother Adekunle placed a hand on Folarin's shoulder. His voice, deep and sincere, carried the weight of years. "You're the only person I fully trust in this world," he said. The words fell like jewels, but Folarin's heart twisted them into weapons. And though Adekunle couldn't see it, Amara, watching silently from the corridor, felt the chill of those words sink into her bones, for she knew trust was the very blade that would cut him deepest. Once, Folarin had walked behind Adekunle like a shadow, unnoticed and unimportant. Now, in smoky penthouses and gilded lounges, powerful men leaned toward him, hanging on his words. And for the first time in his life, he tasted the sweetness of power, and it was addictive. Folarin never imagined betrayal could feel this intoxicating. At first, it had been a plan born of resentment, a desperate grasp for relevance. But as days turned into weeks, he found himself savoring the thrill of secret control. He no longer felt like the forgotten brother, he was the puppeteer, pulling invisible strings that Adekunle could not see. In hidden corners of Lagos's most exclusive venues, he attended secret gatherings with rival businessmen. These weren't ordinary meetings. They were bathed in dim light, filled with the scent of expensive cigars, and accompanied by glasses of rare cognac, worth more than some people's annual salaries. Men who had once dismissed him now treated him as an equal, even a leader. They spoke of plans in coded language, of market collapses and media leaks, of shares shifting like pieces on a chessboard. And always, they reminded him of the crown that could be his if Adekunle stumbled. "The throne is closer than you think," one rival said with a sly smile, sliding a cigar across the table toward him. Another leaned in, his voice low. "The empire is vast, but every empire has a weak foundation. With you on our side, Folarin, we can build something new." The words were fire to his ego. For years, he had been overlooked, dismissed, and belittled. Now, these powerful men saw him as essential. It was as though his shadow had finally bloomed into a figure of its own. His sense of superiority grew daily. He walked into rooms with his chin higher, his steps firmer. He bought new suits, tailored to perfection, wore watches that gleamed like miniature suns, and spoke with an authority he had never known before. Even in Adekunle's presence, he felt less like the younger brother and more like the man who would one day replace him. And then there was Chica. She was his mistress, a woman of striking beauty who moved through Lagos nightlife like a queen without a crown. With her fiery eyes and velvet laugh, she whispered promises into his ear. "The moment Adekunle falls, you'll be unstoppable. They'll write about you. They'll fear you. And I'll be right there, beside the most powerful man in Nigeria." Her touch made his ambition burn brighter. Her lips tasted of champagne and danger. She flattered the darkest parts of him, feeding the hunger that no wealth had ever satisfied. The hunger to be seen, to be celebrated, to be the man. Meanwhile, the city around him pulsed with contrasts. Lagos nightlife blazed with neon lights, music thundering from clubs in Victoria Island where fortunes were exchanged in whispers over dance floors. Men like Folarin thrived there, soaking in the excess, draped in temptation. But across town, in the quiet quarters of the Banana Island mansion, Amara moved silently through her duties. While Folarin drowned in the seduction of power, she clung to loyalty and prayer, sensing the storm growing closer. Each time she saw strange men leaving the mansion in the dead of night, each time she caught Folarin's laughter echoing down the halls with false sweetness, her unease deepened. She had no proof, only intuition, but that was enough. And yet, she remained silent, caught between fear and duty. Adekunle, blissfully unaware, pressed forward with his European expansion. He flew in and out of London and Paris, charming investors, making speeches that electrified audiences. His picture graced the covers of magazines. His voice carried hope for Africa's technological future. To him, the cracks were invisible. He saw only progress, only applause. But to Amara, who watched the house grow heavier with secrets, the cracks felt like thunder before rain. The contrast was striking. Lagos's glittering nightlife, where Folarin thrived in shadows of indulgence, versus the quiet, loyal heart of a maid who prayed for a man who didn't even know he needed saving. The seduction of power had transformed Folarin. No longer did he envy Adekunle silently. Now, he imagined the empire crumbling into his hands, the Oladimeji name finally resting on his shoulders. One humid evening, as he reclined in his mistress's suite, sipping cognac and listening to her hum softly beside him, his phone vibrated. He picked it up, half expecting another invitation to a private gathering. But the message was different. Short. Sharp. Final. The stage is ready, strike soon. Folarin's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. The game was no longer about envy. It was about conquest. Every night, Amara carried secrets heavier than the silver trays she balanced, secrets that pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. She wanted to scream them into the night, but one wrong word could destroy her life. And yet, silence might destroy Adekunle's. Amara's days followed a rhythm of polished surfaces and quiet obedience, but her nights were different. Each evening, as the mansion's lights dimmed and silence fell, she sat alone on her narrow bed, replaying every whisper she had overheard, every shadow that slipped into Folarin's study, every coded glance that passed between him and strangers. The weight of it grew unbearable. Should she warn Adekunle? Should she speak the truth that clawed at her throat? But fear shackled her. If she accused Folarin and was wrong, her job would vanish, and with it the fragile lifeline that kept her family afloat. Her father's medicine, her brother's school fees, her mother's market stall, all of it depended on her wages. Yet the fear of losing Adekunle cut deeper, for in her heart he was no longer just an employer. He was the man who noticed her silence when others ignored her, who asked after her family without reason, who carried his empire on his shoulders but still found kindness to spare. One evening, unable to hold it in, she turned to the only safe place she had, her journal. In its worn pages, she wrote with trembling hands, "How do you save a man who cannot see the knife at his back? How do you tell him his own brother sharpens it daily?" Tears blurred the ink, but she pressed on, pouring her fears into the paper she would never show another soul. The following night, fate delivered a cruel twist. She was tidying the penthouse when she found Adekunle alone on the balcony, his figure carved in moonlight. A glass of untouched wine rested on the railing, and his eyes were fixed on the restless ocean. "Do you ever feel," he asked suddenly, without turning, "that the more people surround you, the lonelier you become?" Amara froze, unsure if the question was meant for her. He glanced back, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "Sometimes I wonder if wealth builds walls instead of bridges." Her breath caught. She wanted to answer, to tell him that she saw the loneliness he carried, that she admired the man beneath the empire, but her tongue remained tied. She simply bowed her head, whispering, "Yes, sir." What she didn't say was that she had never felt closer to him than in that moment. That night, as she returned to her quarters, her decision crystallized. Her loyalty was stronger than her fear. She could not stand by and watch him walk blindly into betrayal, so she began quietly gathering evidence. She listened more carefully than ever, memorizing names whispered in the dark. She slipped unnoticed into the study when Folarin wasn't there, noting the papers left on desks, the phone numbers scribbled carelessly on notepads. She watched who entered, who left, and when. Every observation became a piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see clearly, but she collected them with determination. Then came the moment that defined her resolve. She returned to her room one night and pulled out the envelope where she had hidden her small savings, the money she had painstakingly stored away for emergencies. She stared at it for a long time, then lit a candle. One by one, she fed the notes into the flame, watching them curl into ash. "Loyalty beyond comfort," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Even if I lose everything, I will not let him fall." It was symbolic, a vow carved into fire. She no longer served for wages. She served for love, for gratitude, for loyalty that could not be bought. From that night on, she became more than a maid. She became a shield, silent, invisible, unnoticed, yet fiercely determined. Adekunle, lost in his empire and blinded by trust, had no idea that his greatest protector lived under his roof. And then, the discovery came. One evening, while dusting the study, Amara noticed Folarin's laptop glowing faintly on the desk. The screen had been left unlocked. Curiosity tugged at her, stronger than fear. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might betray her. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents open before her. Contracts, financial transfers, detailed correspondence with rival businessmen, plans to seize control of key assets, written in cold, precise language. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't intuition. This was proof. She stepped back, trembling, the tray nearly slipping from her hands. From the shadows of the mansion, betrayal had revealed its face, and Amara knew Adekunle's empire was already hanging by a thread. The cracks came quietly at first, like whispers in a crowded room, easy to dismiss, but soon they grew into thunder, and Adekunle Oladimeji, once untouchable, felt the ground beneath his empire shudder as though the very city conspired against him. It began with a single phone call. A European investor who had once spoken with unshakable enthusiasm now stammered through excuses. "We've decided to delay the partnership. Circumstances have changed." Adekunle leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, frowning. Deals didn't just dissolve overnight. Still, he dismissed it as an isolated setback. One investor backing out was unfortunate but hardly fatal. But the next day, another deal faltered. A real estate contract in Dubai, weeks from signing, suddenly evaporated. Then another, an African bank that had been eager to fund his AI expansion, abruptly withdrew support. The pattern was undeniable. Within weeks, his once flawless reputation began to bleed. Rumors spread like wildfire through Lagos's business circles. Whispers of instability, questions about his health, articles appearing in glossy magazines hinting at recklessness. "Has Adekunle grown too big, too fast?" one headline asked. Another, more damning, questioned whether he was losing his edge. For a man who had built his empire on the foundation of respect, the sting was unbearable. Adekunle had always known enemies would circle, but betrayal felt different when it came not from strangers, but from unseen hands close to him. And through it all, he turned to the one man he trusted most. "Folarin," he said one night over brandy in the study, "the tide is shifting against me. Investors are running. The media grows bold. What am I missing?" Folarin, hiding his satisfaction behind a mask of concern, placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "You've been working too hard, Kunle. People see your exhaustion, and they worry. Slow down. Let me handle a few things for you." Adekunle exhaled heavily, gratitude softening his face. "You've always been my anchor." The irony was bitter, but unseen. In trusting his brother, he handed him more of the empire's reins, not knowing he was fueling the very downfall being orchestrated. Amara watched silently as the change in Adekunle deepened. His once confident stride grew heavy, his sharp suits now paired with tired eyes. At dinner, he pushed food around his plate, appetite replaced by worry. She saw him sit alone late at night, massaging his temples as if the weight of Lagos itself rested on his skull. Her hands itched to reveal what she knew. The documents, the whispers, the meetings she had witnessed, all proof that Folarin was the storm battering Adekunle's walls. But fear clenched her throat. What if he didn't believe her? What if exposing herself cost her not only her job, but his trust? So she prayed silently, watching him unravel. The city itself seemed to mock his decline. Lagos traffic jams trapped him in endless hours of frustration, as though the very roads conspired against his punctuality. PHCN blackouts struck at crucial moments, once plunging his penthouse into darkness in the middle of a high-stakes virtual meeting with European investors. He tried to laugh it off, but their uneasy glances lingered long after the lights returned. Even the weather turned against him. One evening, as he reviewed collapsing balance sheets, a storm tore across the Atlantic, lashing against the penthouse windows with a violence that mirrored his turmoil. Lightning illuminated his reflection in the glass. A man once mighty, now staring at himself like a stranger. His inner thoughts grew darker with each passing day. How did it all come to this? How could contracts vanish like smoke? Have I lost my touch? Have I lost myself? Exhaustion crept into his bones. Nights bled into dawn without rest, his mind a battlefield of figures and fears. He replayed every decision, searching for the wrong turn, never suspecting that the knife had been slipped in by the very hand he trusted most. And always, Amara hovered nearby, the silent witness. She pressed her lips together as she watched him crumble, her heart aching with every sigh that escaped him. The more he faltered, the deeper her loyalty rooted. She wanted to step into the storm, to shield him from it, but she remained in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. One night, after a day of rejections and closed doors, Adekunle stood again at his balcony. The rain lashed against him, soaking his tailored shirt, but he didn't move. He gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened, his chest rising and falling in harsh breaths. "If I lose this empire," he whispered into the roaring storm, "I lose myself." The words were carried away by thunder, but they carved themselves into Amara's heart, heavy as prophecy. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder or fireworks. It creeps in quietly, threading itself into silences, shared glances, and unspoken words. For Adekunle and Amara, love was not declared. It was woven in the spaces between despair and hope, in the shadows of a collapsing empire. The decline of Adekunle's empire should have consumed every fragment of his attention, Yet it was in those darkest days that he began to notice the one person who had always been near, silent and steady Amara. At first, it was her quiet wisdom that struck him. One evening, after a grueling investor meeting that ended with yet another withdrawal, he slumped in the study, his head buried in his hands. He had chased deals across continents, dazzled rooms with speeches, yet watched opportunities slip away as though cursed. Amara entered timidly with a tray of tea. She set it down gently, her presence light, as if she feared disturbing the storm within him. He looked up, his eyes red with fatigue, and muttered, "They don't even give me reasons anymore, just polite refusals." Her gaze softened. "Sometimes, sir," she said carefully, "people fear what they do not understand. Perhaps it isn't you they doubt, but their own courage to follow." He studied her face, simple, yet striking in its sincerity. She hadn't meant it as comfort, only truth, but it soothed him more than the polished reassurances of board members or advisors. He found himself nodding, holding her gaze longer than propriety allowed. That was the beginning. In the days that followed, he sought her presence without realizing it. At meals, he noticed how attentively she listened when he spoke, never interrupting, never pretending to know more than she did. In the evenings, he found himself lingering in the kitchen when she cleared the table, curious about her life, and she told him, hesitantly at first, about the village she left behind, about her father's illness, about the siblings who looked to her as both sister and mother. He listened with unexpected interest, recognizing in her struggles an echo of his own burden's responsibility that stretched beyond choice, beyond comfort. The more they shared, the more the gap between Billionaire and Maid seemed to blur. Beneath wealth and poverty, they were simply two weary souls carrying worlds on their shoulders. Romantic tension grew silently, unspoken yet undeniable. Their eyes lingered a fraction too long. Their words carried undercurrents neither dared name. He began to see her not in her uniform, but in her essence, her loyalty, her strength, her quiet intelligence. She was no longer invisible, and Amara, though torn by fear of overstepping, felt her heart betraying her. She had promised herself loyalty, not love, yet each kindness from him chipped away at her resolve. When he asked after her family, when he ensured her father received better treatment, when he walked past her with a smile meant only for her, it was impossible not to feel. The mansion itself seemed to conspire to draw them closer. One evening, Nepa struck, plunging the house into darkness. The generator faltered, leaving only flickering candlelight and the sound of rain against the windows. Adekunle, restless, came into the kitchen where Amara was preparing a simple meal by lantern light. Instead of ordering dinner from a chef or retreating to his study, he sat across from her at the small table, his shirt sleeves rolled up, exhaustion softened by the intimacy of the moment. They ate together rice and beans, humble and warm. For Adekunle, it was the first real meal he'd shared in weeks without the weight of investors or rivals. For Amara, it was a dream she hadn't dared imagine, sitting face to face with the man she had sworn to protect, their laughter mingling in the glow of weak light. When the power surged back, flooding the room with brightness, both of them blinked, as if the intimacy of the darkness had been a fragile spell broken too soon. But love had already begun its quiet bloom. They didn't confess, they didn't need to. It lived in the silence, in the way he now sought her counsel, in the way her hands trembled when she poured his wine, in the way his gaze lingered when she walked away. Yet the shadow of betrayal loomed large, for even as their bond deepened, Folarin's schemes tightened their grip on Adekunle's empire. Amara carried the burden of knowledge, her love for Adekunle now interwoven with terror. One night, as she stood by his side while he stared into the horizon, the weight of silence nearly broke her. Her heart raced, her lips parted. "Sir," she whispered, voice shaking, "there's something I must tell you." The words hung in the air like fragile glass, ready to shatter everything. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come with daggers or poison, it comes wrapped in ribbons, polished with affection, and handed over as a gift. And as Adekunle accepted the gleaming antique car from his brother, he had no idea he was embracing the hand that was already tightening around his empire's throat. The car arrived on a bright Saturday morning, delivered to the Banana Island mansion with the ceremony of royalty. A 1965 Rolls-Royce Phantom, polished to perfection, its chrome gleaming like liquid silver under the Lagos Sunday, a symbol of timeless class, the kind of vehicle that collectors whispered about in reverence. Folarin beamed as the car rolled into the courtyard. "For you, brother," he announced grandly, spreading his arms. "You've worked too hard. This is my way of showing gratitude." Adekunle's eyes widened with boyish wonder. He circled the car, his hand running along its polished curves. Folarin, this must have cost a fortune. His brother laughed, modest and warm. What's money between family? You've always carried me. Let me, for once, carry you. The staff applauded politely, and Amara, standing at the steps, forced herself to clap along. But her chest tightened. She saw through the glittering gesture. It was too grand, too well timed, arriving at a moment when Adekunle's empire was trembling. A gift, not to honor, but to distract. Still, Adekunle's face glowed with gratitude. For all his brilliance, for all his instincts in business, he was blind when it came to Folarin. That night, as Adekunle sat with advisors who cautiously warned him about leaks in the company, about suspicious moves that seemed to come from within, he silenced them with a raised hand. "My brother is the only man I trust completely," he said firmly. "Whatever storms we face together." Folarin, sitting across the room with a glass of brandy, offered a solemn nod, his eyes hiding a flicker of triumph. Meanwhile, in the hidden corners of Lagos's high society, Folarin's rivals, his new allies, celebrated. They raised glasses in private lounges, toasting to Adekunle's crumbling empire. "The king is falling," one murmured, "and his brother holds the crown." Every cheer, every sip of champagne in those hidden rooms was a nail hammered into Adekunle's throne. Amara, however, refused to stay idle. The weight of the documents she had seen on Folarin's laptop haunted her. Fear clawed at her heart, but loyalty drove her actions. Late at night, when the mansion slept, she returned to the study. Hands trembling, she opened drawers, snapped pictures of contracts with her small phone, copied details of financial transfers, captured emails, left glowing on Folarin's laptop screen. Each piece of evidence was tucked away, hidden beneath her mattress, her silent arsenal against betrayal. Every step she took was dangerous. If discovered, she would lose everything. But the image of Adekunle's tired eyes, his whispered confession of trust, strengthened her resolve. The tension thickened with each passing day. Adekunle began to sense something about Amara, though he couldn't quite name it. He found himself lingering in her presence, confiding in her with words he would never share with board members. Her quiet strength steadied him in ways grand gestures never could. One evening, as he leaned against the balcony railing, exhausted from another failed negotiation, he glanced at her as she cleared away his untouched dinner. "Amara," he said softly, "I don't know how you do it, but when you're near, I feel calmer." She froze, her heart racing. "I'm just doing my duty, sir." But inside, she burned with the weight of love she could not voice. All the while, Folarin's net drew tighter. The decisive moment came in a sleek boardroom overlooking the Atlantic. Adekunle sat at the head of the table, his pen poised above a contract. His advisors shifted uneasily, whispering concerns about clauses they barely understood. But Folarin leaned close, smiling with brotherly warmth. "Trust me," he urged. "This is the deal that will save everything. Sign, and the investors will return." Adekunle looked at his brother, the man he had defended, the man he had called his anchor. Doubt flickered for the briefest moment, but he pushed it away. With a steady hand, he signed. The ink dried quickly, binding him to terms he didn't understand, to a trap carefully laid by the brother he loved. Back at the mansion, Amara sat in her small room, clutching the phone where she stored the evidence. A storm brewed outside, lightning flickering across the sea. She didn't know what Adekunle had just done, but her chest ached with dread. For in that single stroke of a pen, Adekunle Oladimeji had unknowingly sealed the fate of his empire. Some truths burn the tongue before they are spoken, yet silence burns the soul. Amara had carried her secret like fire in her chest for weeks, but tonight she could no longer hold it in. The empire was crumbling, and if she didn't speak now, Adekunle would fall into the abyss blind. It happened on a night heavy with rain. The mansion rattled with thunder, and lightning cracked across the Atlantic, illuminating the glass walls of Adekunle's study. He sat slumped in his leather chair, papers scattered before him, documents he didn't know were already poisoned. Amara lingered at the doorway, her hands trembling as they clutched the envelope where she had stored every copied document, every incriminating message she had risked her livelihood to collect. Her heart pounded so hard she feared he would hear it. "Sir," she began softly. Adekunle looked up, his eyes tired, his shirt collar loosened. "Amara, you should rest. It's late." Her throat tightened. "If I don't speak now, I may never have another chance." She stepped forward, her voice shaking. There's something you must know. Something I can't hide anymore. His brow furrowed. What is it? Her hands quivered as she placed the envelope on his desk. Your brother, Folarin. He is not what you think he is. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Then Adekunle chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Amara, not you too. Everyone suspects him, but he is my blood, my only brother. She swallowed hard, her courage pressed against the wall of his disbelief. Please, look. Her fingers shook as she opened the envelope and spread out the copy's contracts, signed in secret, financial transfers to rivals, messages planning his downfall. Lightning flashed through the glass, illuminating the damning evidence. Adekunle's eyes scanned the papers, his face hardening with every line. At first, denial fought fiercely within him. He shook his head, muttering, No, this can't be. He wouldn't. But the truth was undeniable. The handwriting was his brother's. The signatures carried the weight of betrayal. The air in the room thickened. Adekunle leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His eyes were glassy, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might shatter his teeth. For years, he had trusted, defended, loved Folarin more than anyone else, and now, that trust was broken beyond repair. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. His empire was collapsing, but worse than that, his brother had been the architect of its destruction. Adekunle lowered his head into his hands. For a man the world called indestructible, the sight of him breaking quietly in his own study was more shattering than any storm outside. Amara's heart ached at the sight. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she rested it gently on his arm. He didn't flinch, didn't move. Sir, she whispered, her voice trembling but steadying with each word. You are not alone. They can strip you of wealth, they can shake your empire, but they cannot take you. You are more than money, more than your brother's betrayal, and if you lose everything else, you will still have my loyalty. Her words cracked something inside him, not like the crack of thunder, but like glass splintering under weight. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not investors, not partners, not women who claimed to love him. Amara's voice carried no agenda, no price, only truth. He raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. In them, he saw no greed, no calculation, only sincerity so pure it frightened him. Their silence became intimate, charged. He saw her not as a maid but as the anchor he hadn't known he needed. She saw him not as a billionaire, but as a man stripped of illusions. The distance between them dissolved. Adekunle exhaled, his voice breaking. I don't know how to move forward from this. You don't have to, Amara replied softly. Not tonight. Just breathe. Tomorrow will come. Her hand lingered on his arm, and in that touch was more comfort than all his riches had ever bought. The storm raged outside, but within the study, something fragile yet undeniable had bloomed in intimacy that whispered of love, born in the ruins of betrayal. Adekunle straightened slowly, his face a mixture of pain and resolve. He gathered the documents, his hand shaking only once before steadying. If this is true, he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of steel, everything must change tonight. The words lingered in the room, heavy with promise and peril. Amara's heart raced. She had handed him the truth. Now, the storm would decide what he did with it. Empires crumble in silence, but they can also rise from ashes. Adekunle Oladimeji had stared into the abyss of betrayal, tasted despair, and nearly surrendered. But now, with the truth in his hands and loyalty at his side, he prepared not only to survive but to rise stronger than before. The morning after Amara's revelation, Adekunle woke with a heaviness that felt different. It wasn't the weight of defeat anymore. It was the weight of decision. The storm of betrayal had broken him, yes, but in its ruins, something harder, sharper had been forged. He stood before the mirror in his penthouse, straightening his suit, his reflection pale from sleepless nights but steadier than it had been in weeks. The documents Amara had given him were tucked in his briefcase. Today, he would not walk into his boardroom as a man begging for trust. Today, he would walk in as a man armed with truth. Amara stood quietly in the corner, watching him. For the first time, he looked at her not as a servant waiting for instructions, but as a partner in his fight. Stay close today, he told her softly. When this ends, I want the world to know who truly stood by me. Her chest tightened, but she nodded. The boardroom was tense when he entered. Investors, restless and skeptical, murmured among themselves. Folarin was already there, smiling as though victory was sealed, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture dripping confidence. Adekunle took his seat at the head of the table. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then, slowly, he drew the documents from his briefcase and spread them across the polished mahogany. The room froze. Emails, signatures, transfers, proof of collusion with rivals. The betrayal was naked, undeniable. Gasps echoed as the board members leaned forward, reading the evidence that exposed Folarin's treachery. Adekunle's voice was steady, though it carried the sting of heartbreak. The man you trusted alongside me, the man I called brother, has been the architect of this empire's collapse. Folarin's mask faltered. He reached for words, but they failed him. The investors turned, their eyes narrowing, their trust dissolving. In that moment, Adekunle did what great leaders do, he turned the tables. But, he continued firmly, what was meant to destroy me has revealed the truth. I built this empire with vision, not deceit, and I will rebuild it with loyalty, not betrayal. The board, stunned by his resolve, began to rally. One by one, key investors nodded, murmuring approval. They had come ready to withdraw, but what they saw was not a broken man, it was a leader reborn. Folarin rose abruptly, fury in his eyes. You think you can erase me? I am still your brother. Adekunle met his gaze with pain but also clarity. No. You stopped being my reside, brother, the moment you sold your loyalty. The words struck like thunder. Folarin stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the marble hall. But his shadow lingered, dark, dangerous, unfinished. When the meeting ended, Adekunle stood taller than he had in months. He had reclaimed control of key assets, salvaged contracts, and proven to his investors that resilience was stronger than sabotage. The empire trembled, yes, but it had not fallen, and by his side, the quiet figure who had made it possible finally stepped into the light. At a small press gathering later that week, Adekunle did something unthinkable for a man of his stature. He turned to Amara, the maid once invisible, and acknowledged her publicly. In the darkest hours of this storm, when everyone else doubted me, one person stood firm. Her loyalty reminded me what no wealth can buy. The room buzzed with surprise. Amara lowered her gaze, overwhelmed, but Adekunle's words burned into her heart like fire. That evening, on the same balcony where he had once confessed loneliness, Adekunle turned to her. The city lights glittered below, the storm clouds finally clearing. I need you to hear this, he said, his voice trembling with vulnerability. I thought I needed wealth to anchor me, but what I needed was loyalty, and in you, Amara, I found both loyalty and something more. I love you. Her breath caught. She had dreamed of these words in silence, never daring to hope. Now, they wrapped around her like a promise. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "And I love you too." They stood together, no longer billionaire and maid, but man and woman bound by trust, by love, by survival. Adekunle's reflection turned inward one last time. Wealth can be stolen, but loyalty builds empires. As the sun rose over Lagos, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, it felt like a new beginning, not just for Adekunle's empire, but for the love born from its ruins. Yet far away, in a shadowed lounge, Folarin sat with a glass of brandy, his eyes cold as steel. He watched the headlines flash across the screen, Adekunle's recovery, the whispers of his new love. His lips curled into a dark smile. "This isn't over," he whispered. The empire had survived the storm, but another shadow was already gathering. If you were in Adekunle's place, would you forgive Folarin or never look back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm eager to read them.